calling the meeting to order. This is meeting number 38 of the Standing Committee on International Trade. Welcome to our committee members and our replacements. It's nice to see some other faces at the table as well. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to House Order of June 23, 2022, and therefore members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. I need to make a few comments for the benefit of witnesses and members. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. When speaking, please speak slowly and clearly. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you are not speaking. With regard to interpretation, for those on Zoom, you have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either floor, English, or French. For those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. For members in the room, if you wish to speak, please raise your hand. For members on Zoom, please use the raise hand function. The clerk and I will manage the speaking order as best as we can. So we appreciate your patience and understanding in this regard. Please also note that during the meeting, it's not permitted to take pictures in the room or screenshots. And Madam Clerk, can we just verify with our translator that everything is in good shape? Everything is fine with the translators? All right. Thank you. In accordance with the committee's routine motion concerning connection tests for witnesses appearing by video conference, I am informing the committee that all witnesses have completed the required connection test in advance of the meeting. Should any technical challenges arise, please let me know. And if necessary, we will suspend a few minutes in order to ensure that all members get to participate fully. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Tuesday, September the 20th, 2022, the committee is resuming its study of potential trade impacts of the United States Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 on certain firms and workers in Canada. Today we have with us as an individual Genevieve Dufour, Professor Universitaire de Sherbrooke. Canadian Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Association, Yvette Vera Perez, President and Chief Executive Officer by video conference. And from the Chemistry Industry Association of Canada, Bob Masterson, President and Chief Executive Officer, is here in person with us. And from Smart Prosperity Institute, Derek Eaton, Senior Director, Public Policy Research and Outreach by video conference. Welcome to you all. Thank you for taking some time out of your schedule to share some of the knowledge and information you have with the committee. Madame Dufour, I invite you to make an opening statement of up to 5 minutes, please.
Madam Chair, thank you. And ladies and gentlemen, members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to speak today. My name is Geneviève Dufour, and I'm a professor of international law specializing in international trade law at University of Sherbrooke's Faculty of Law. It's a pleasure for me to be here today to talk about the Inflation Reduction Act. I congratulate you on having taken up the issue, since it seems to me this law, with its major impacts, has received very little attention in recent months. I've listened to the work you've been doing over the last few days, and it seemed appropriate to focus my intervention on the legality of the IRA under international trade rules. I understand that several of you want some clarification in this regard.
The way, the Reduction Inflation Act is clearly illegal under international trade rules. First, it violates the national treatment principle, which aims to avoid protectionist measure. It also violates the principle of most favored nation treatments, which requires states not to discriminate between trading partners. Alors, je viens de dire que ça viole.
Sorry, Madame Dufour, we seem to have a problem.
Oui.
All right, I have to suspend for a moment. Again,
Au début,
From the beginning?
at the beginning?
yes.
Okay.
Good day, Madam Chair, and thank you very much, members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to speak today. My name is Geneviève Dufour. I'm professor of international law, specializing in international trade law at the University of Sherbrooke's Faculty of Law. And I was just saying it's a real pleasure to be here today. And I congratulate you for raising this issue, because it seems to me that this law, with its major impacts, has received very little attention in recent months. I've listened to your work in the last few days, and it seemed appropriate to focus my intervention on the legality of the IRA under international trade rules. Indeed, I understand that several members of the committee want clarification in this regard.
Juste couper ma traduction. Donc, let's say it right away. The Reduction Inflation Act is clearly illegal under international trade rules. First, it violates the national treatment principle, which aims to avoid protectionist measure. It also violates the principle of most favored nation treatment, which requires states not to discriminate between trading parties.
It also most likely violates the WTO agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures insofar as, in order to receive the tax credits, the Act requires the use of batteries with 50% North American content by 2024 and 100% by 2028. And, as is well known, any subsidy conditioned on the use of domestic content is categorically prohibited under the SCM agreement. It's therefore clear that the Act violates basic international trade rules. The question is therefore to determine whether the U.S. can invoke an exception. Some have raised the issue of protection of natural resources, which is an exception, but there's still not enough information to determine whether the law passes the test of this exception. We'll have to pay attention to how the U.S. applies the law. And we can already question certain elements, including favoritism towards Canada and the fact that protectionist restriction imposed by the law could ultimately disadvantage the production of electric vehicles in the United States and thus be harmful to environment protection.
Ask whether the CUSMA allows the U.S. to favor Canada and Mexico. FTAs allow states to give each other tariff advantages and to work together to harmonize their practices and measures. Under no circumstances do FTAs allow a state to provide subsidies to companies that use domestic goods or goods from a state with which it has a free trade area. Finally, the U.S. will probably try to justify this law in the name of energy security. They will therefore most likely want to invoke the national security exception, at least for the foreign entity of concern portion of the law. Analyzed quickly, this exception hardly applies to the law.
Among experts, there's no doubt that this law goes against the rules of international trade. Of course, this is not the first time that the U.S. or other countries have adopted a measure that goes against the law. However, this act is unique for several reasons. One, because it's very far-reaching. The law has the avowed objective of reorganizing supply chains, and this in the most powerful country in terms of trade. Also, by its objective of assumed protectionism. Also, by its assumed illegality. Everyone involved in its drafting and passage knows that it is illegal in terms of international trade rules. And finally, It is very unique by its unfriendly character. As French President Emmanuel Macron said, this act is completely unfriendly. And this led him to call for a European wake-up call, pointing to the fact that two major partners of Europe are benefiting from major state aid. And he called on Europeans to react. So what can we expect? President Trump denounced China's illegal subsidies and responded with a trade war that all countries denounce. President Biden is now passing a protectionist law providing for illegal subsidies, and the reaction to this law is likely to be different this time. We can imagine a protectionist spiral, and one wonders what international trade will look like in the future. And you have to wonder how a country like Canada, a country that has always advocated respect for the rule of law, will position itself in this new landscape. This is fundamentally important, as the IRA is likely to have significant systemic impacts. Thank you very much.
Madame Dufour. Ms. Vera Perez, please, for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Madam Chair and members of the committee. Thank you for the invitation to speak here today. My name is Yvette Vera Perez, and I am the President and CEO at the Canadian Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Association, CHFCA. We represent over 160 companies at all stages of the hydrogen and fuel cell supply chain. Our members export clean technologies to over 42 countries, which account for 65% of the world population. According to a recent study by Ernst & Young, hydrogen's total Canadian annual market potential could reach $100 billion and create up to 350,000 jobs by 2050. And that is in addition to the Government of Canada's estimate that the sector will assist with reducing Canada's emissions by 45 million metric tons annually. With a 100-year legacy of industry and research expertise, Canada's hydrogen and fuel cell sector has, until recently, been a global leader in the space. But unlike 100 years ago, we have competition for this leadership position. Countries around the world have rolled out policies and funding for the advancement of their domestic hydrogen and fuel cell industry. One of these policies is what brings us together today, the United States Inflation Reduction Act, IRA. IRA contains several measures that make investing in the U.S. attractive. The investment and production tax credits for clean hydrogen and other incentives to produce clean technologies and clean energy, which are essential elements of the hydrogen supply chain, are all very attractive opportunities. This, in addition to the ease of use for companies accessing the measures and a very well-resourced regulatory approval process, add to the opportunity presented. I am aware that Canada can't respond in kind to the US IRA. We have a smaller market and different structure, but we have several measures in Canada that we could take, which would better incentivize investment in our own domestic hydrogen industry. The recent fall economic statement provided great news to the cleantech sector, with a 30% investment tax credit ITC for clean technologies and a 40% ITC for hydrogen technologies. These tax credits, in addition to the creation of the Canada Growth Fund, which includes contracts for difference for hydrogen, will help incentivize domestic production of low-carbon hydrogen. As we work to gain clarity on the operational details around the hydrogen ITCs and Cleantech Growth Fund, there are several recommendations that I would like to share with this panel. First, we should focus on rapidly deploying a fully functional and clear ITC with clear guidelines in terms of boundaries, eligibility criteria, processing timing, and how these ITCs interact with other programs. This will give investors and project proponents much needed clarity as they develop their projects and secure financing. Second, when exploring the potential of the clean hydrogen ITC in the fall economic statement, expanding the scope of this credit, at least in part to apply to operational costs beyond capital costs, could provide the flexibility needed to support companies in the industry. Third, programs like the Strategic Innovation Fund and Clean Fuels Fund are great signals of the ambition the government has for Canada's clean tech industry. but the resource-intensive application process and long wait times are a deterrent to project proponents. We must commit to reasonable turnaround times for CIF, CFF, CIB, or any other future funding. And furthermore, we must consider how these programs and the ITC incentives interact with each other and help elevate each other. This is a complex issue, and comparing the US to Canada can seem like comparing apples to oranges, but that is a comparison that companies and investors in the sector make in their everyday decision-making. In closing, Canada has always been at the forefront of the global hydrogen industry, but with the rapid development of the sector and our lack of action at home until today, Canada is falling behind. The Fall Economic Statement is a solid first step to help us reclaim our leadership position. The devil, however, is in the details. We must invest smartly, heavily, and rapidly to reclaim our leadership position in the hydrogen sector. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. On to Mr. Masterson for 5 minutes, please.
Yes. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, committee members, for this timely and important study, and also for the opportunity to be before you in person today. Chemistry and plastics is your third largest manufacturing sector in Canada, with about $90 billion in annual shipments. 80% of that is exported, and the vast majority of that is the United States. In short, the United States is our largest customer, but it's also our largest competitor, both for market share, but also for investment share. Globally, our industry is embarking on two simultaneous and major transformations. The transformation for a zero-carbon chemistry sector and the transformation for a circular economy for plastics. In short, it's no longer a question of environment policy, it's entirely a question of investment policy. This sector will invest, it will transform, it will do so rapidly. The only question is where those investments are going to take place. I'd like to start with some good news. After several decades without major new chemistry investments in this nation, we have 2 global-scale facilities that will enter commercial operation in 2023. That's some start of good news. But also in the last 18 months, we've had over 15 major project announcements in our sector worth more than $30 billion of proposed new investments. And here's the interesting part. Every one of those investments is envisioned as net carbon zero from initial operation. Now, those projects are largely in response to very aggressive investment attraction efforts from the province of Quebec and the province of Alberta. But I have to stress, though, these are proposals only. Much work remains to turn them into final investment decisions and built infrastructure. And my main message to you today is that indeed the US IRA is a game changer, and I can't imagine that there's not one of those projects that won't be reevaluated from a due diligence perspective to see how the Canadian business case matches up with the new business case under the IRA in the US. My second point is it's not just those new investments that are at stake. To transform our sector, we have about $300 billion of built chemistry infrastructure in Canada today. To reach net zero, we have to recapitalize every penny of that in the next 3 decades. And our ability to do so will depend entirely on improving investment conditions in Canada. Definitely, the IRA contains long-lived incentives. It covers all 5 of the pathways available to decarbonize the chemistry sector. All 5 of the pathways have various incentives available to them. The incentives can be stacked. They're already on top of major advantages that are in place at the state and federal level, and that includes accelerated capital cost allowance, which, unlike Canada, is not going to start to fade away in 2023. My final point is this, though. The true value of the IRA's incentives and the biggest challenge for Canada is the transparency and certainty provided to investors. And if you'll, I know you've heard a lot about carrots and sticks, but if you allow me perhaps a seasonal analogy, what I'd say is all industries in Canada are on the naughty list. We pay a very steep and ever-steepening carbon price. Some very fortunate few, they do find their way on the nice list. They do get hand-picked access to federal grants, tax, loans, other incentives to assist with decarbonization. But here's the thing. The criteria to get on the list are not transparent, they're not clear, they're not available to everybody, and that means you can't build them into a business case. That puts Canada at a disadvantage. In contrast, in the United States, no industry or company is on any naughty list. Everybody's on the nice list. Everybody can look at the IRA and factor in these very real, very material, very accessible incentives into the business case for proposed industrial decarbonization projects. So as time allows in questions, I'd like to share further details that compare and contrast investment attractiveness for decarbonization of the chemistry sector in the U.S. Versus Canada today. Thank you again for this opportunity.
Thank you very much. Much appreciated, Mr. Meston. Mr. Eaton, please, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee for inviting me here today. My name is Derek Eaton. I am the Senior Director of Public Policy Research and Outreach at the Smart Prosperity Institute, which is a clean economy think tank housed at the University of Ottawa. I'd just like to quickly acknowledge that I reside on the unceded traditional and ancestral territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and Wendat nations, and we recognize the unique and enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous peoples and their traditional territories worldwide. So the Inflation Reduction Act is positive for Canadian businesses because it provides more certainty about an economic decarbonization strategy for North America's largest economy. The range of measures included in the Act are likely to weather political changes in the US because they are part of what has been called a new productivist agenda for economic policy, focusing on well-paying jobs and diverse, inclusive growth opportunities in various regions of the United States. The Act does, though, put pressure on Canada to determine its economic place in the net zero transition. Otherwise, we will see businesses and jobs move to the US or not consider Canada as an attractive option. As a small, open economy, highly integrated with our large neighbor to the south, Canada cannot afford to take a passive approach to our economic transition. But this is largely what we have done. The government has created an array of incentives and funding mechanisms to encourage investment in clean energy and clean tech. The latest of these is the Canada Growth Fund. But the approach being taken is to generally leave it to market forces to determine where the best individual funding opportunities are. And the problem with this approach is that it ignores what we know from history about how new economic clusters emerge and consolidate in areas of innovative technology. The coordination of investment opportunities locally, regionally, up and down a value chain is critically important and requires a strategic approach to the identification of a pipeline of projects. Modern industrial policy is about this coordination, which, although challenging, is pursued by many of our major trading partners. And modern industrial policy differs from what has happened in the past, which has tended to focus on supporting individual companies with government subsidies, instead of looking at how to support the growth of an industrial ecosystem. Work by Smart Prosperity and the Transition Accelerator, as well as others, including the Canadian Climate Institute, RBC, has identified a number of Canada's top opportunity areas in the net zero transition. These include electric vehicles and the battery supply chain, carbon capture, utilization and storage, biofuels, especially sustainable aviation fuels, hydrogen, alternative proteins, mass timber, critical minerals, and ag tech. These growth areas all present opportunities to transform Canada's legacy industries in oil and gas, forestry, mining, aerospace, agriculture, and automotive manufacturing into world-leading climate solutions ecosystems. So how can Canada begin to take a more strategic approach as a response to the Inflation Reduction Act? The process can be boiled down to two simple action items. One is to set bold and clear economic targets to guide strategy in priority opportunity areas. Canada should create net zero competitiveness goals, and goals here mean quantitative economic targets that refer to physical actions, improvement, production, and deployment of technologies. Net zero means indexed to the government mandates or our net zero targets, and competitiveness means benchmarked to a vision of Canada's place in the global supply chains of 2030 and looking forward to 2050. These targets must be supported by clear supply chain strategy that seeks to build economic value in Canada while identifying export opportunities. The target should be used to focus public funds and guide policy design at the sectoral level. The second major action item is to create inclusive partnerships to foster strategic collaboration. Canada needs new forms of collaboration between First Nations, government, industry, finance, university, and civil society. Collaborative forums here should not be talking shops, but active working groups that set and revise targets, create strategies, seed projects, and identify high priority investments. Brokers and independent intermediaries are crucial to the process of collaboration. It's important to empower independent voices that can provide expertise and to help develop projects. An independent agency of this type could be in government, so long as it is insulated from politics and free from bureaucratic routines. Or it could come from civil society, or they could be true public-private partnerships, organizations built for the purpose of catalyzing strategic collaboration for net zero. I thank you for this opportunity, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Eaton. On to Mr. Seaback for 6 minutes, please.
Great. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I want to pick up on the opportunity Mr. Masterson gave to expand upon some of his comments. You talked about the investments for net zero. It must be massive investments. I think RBC says $2 trillion between now and 2050, $80 billion a year. Government brags about $9 billion they've invested over the last 3 years. It's nowhere close. You talked about the IRA has 5 pathways for investment in your industry in order to get to those net zero goals. What are those 5 pathways that they're investing in? Is Canada coming close to matching them?
Yeah. So just to be clear, the chemistry sector has 5 pathways to decarbonization, and the IRA covers all those plus. So if we talk about those individually, you can start with hydrogen production and utilization. And so, for example, we have one major proposal, Dow Canada in Fort Saskatchewan, to build the world's first net zero petrochemical facility, and they will consume their own hydrogen and bring in other hydrogen to offset natural gas use. Second one, very important, that hydrogen production and utilization covered by the IRA. Okay.
Is it covered by what Canada's released so far?
Again, in Canada, there are opportunities to apply for certain incentives. You may or may not get those. Again, you cannot build that into your business case.
But you get that in the United States?
You will under the IRA. They're very transparent.
Okay.
So
next.
Second, you would have carbon capture, utilization, and storage. If you go back, the United States had the Q45 tax credit. Canada proposed an ITC, an investment tax credit for carbon capture. Our estimate was the Q45 was about twice as robust as the Canadian proposal. Under the IRA, that's at least doubled. Our analysis says it's now 4 times better than what Canada's proposing. Wow. We have members that will tell you, and they've been into See Finance Canada opening up their books, they'll tell you on a project-to-project comparison basis, it's actually 8 times better in the U.S. But again, here's the most important thing. Under the IRA and the Q45, it's just in the tax code. If you want to do it, the tax incentive is available. What's proposed in Canada is you would have to get permission from the Minister of Environment and the Minister of Resources to obtain a tax credit. So
and you might be on the naughty list and then not get it.
You might be on the naughty list and not get it. So what is the criteria? So there's a second one. Electrification is another example that's covered in the IRA. A lot of information about electrification. And there's many opportunities in our sector. You could be looking at small nuclear reactors. You could be looking at solar installations. You could look at a battery storage. We have battery storage proposals in Canada. We have solar proposals in our sector. Those are all covered under the IRA, and again, all very transparent. And I mean, I could go on further, but I think you get the point. The main message here is we do have opportunities to seek support to help accelerate decarbonization of our sector. But when it comes to the federal level, it's all behind a black box. There's no transparency. And that's okay, but you just have to recognize that if you're an investor, if you're looking to investors, they can't build it into a business case. As soon as something says ministerial decision, the value of that is 0 until you get it.
Right.
That's
so
the challenge.
In the United States, before the IRA and now with the IRA, you can say these things are available in the tax code. I can factor that in my decision where I'm going to invest. In Canada, it's you apply for this, you may or may not get it, et cetera, et cetera. It's a government program, government-run, bureaucratic decision, which you don't know if you're going to get or not get. Is that an accurate summary?
I would say that's very accurate.
You mentioned CCA, Accelerated Capital Cost Allowance in the United States. I think it's a fantastic tool if you want to innovate. You were saying it's sunsetting in Canada in 2023. Now, the government will say, yeah, but we'll renew it. Can you explain how, with Accelerated Capital Cost Allowance, short-term, with opportunities for renewal, how that affects a business case?
Right. So when I talked about two of the projects that are coming into commercial production 2023 in our sector, those started construction in 2014 and 2015. If you're going to build a $5, $7, $10 billion chemistry facility, it's a 5 to 7 year activity. And that's why we asked, and it was present in the Fall Economic Statement 2018, to include the Accelerated Capital Cost Allowance. And it was, but it begins to transition out in 2023. So we've heard from finance that, we didn't see industry really respond. But we did have this thing called COVID, and nobody invested at all. Now, if you look at these 12 projects, 15 projects in our sector that are being proposed today, you're at a disadvantage. If those were in the U.S., you got the Accelerated Capital Cost Allowance for the whole 5 to 7 years going to build that. In Canada, even if you started putting shovels in the ground and buying material today, it starts to deteriorate starting in 2013. You don't get the full advantage of that. So we would say, given the COVID interruption, we think that it was a great idea and it should be revisited and extended for another capital cycle of another 10 years, especially as it's already available in the U.S.
How quickly should the government be responding? They released a fall economic statement with a couple of goodies, but said just wait, the budget's coming, which won't be till March or April. IRA was August 16th. We're going to wait 8 months for the full thing. Is that a big disadvantage to industry? Will industry start making decisions within that 8-month period?
I think that, no, these are long. I don't think so. I do think people will be reevaluating, again, from a due diligence perspective. If you were proposing to build $5 billion of plant in Canada prior to the IRA, your shareholders and your board are demanding that you have another look at that and convince them why it's still the right decision. So I think that reevaluation is going on, but I think it's urgent in the short term, like by budget next year. What is Canada's response to the IRA?
Thank you very much. On to Mr. Varani for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. I'm going to start with thanking all of the witnesses for their testimony. I'm going to start with Ms. Vera Perez. Ms. Vera Perez, you mentioned some of the important investments that were included in the most recent FES. You talked about the clean tech investment tax credit and the 40% tax credit for hydrogen technology. I wanted you to expand a bit upon what the testimony you provided, but also given the context of the most recent visit by German Chancellor Olaf Scholz when he was here, given Germany and other allies and their energy security needs, you're aware that we struck a deal for about $2.5 or $2.6 billion to provide hydrogen-based energy to the Germans. Can you comment on that deal and the potential for other deals like it with respect to these tax credits going forward?
Thank you very much. Pleasure to meet you. I live in your riding. So first, you asked about expanding on the news from Fall Economic Statement. The news is in general good. It's a good first step, but that's what it is. It's a first step. Right now, a lot of the conversations and what we want to focus on the during the consultations is, let's get a fully functional ITC, but also let's understand what the ITC entails. A lot of the questions that I'm getting is, what is eligible? As of when is it eligible? For example, a project that started 12 months ago, would that be eligible? We don't want to penalize the early movers, so hopefully yes. Other questions that I am asked by the members is, for example, what is the timeline to review? As of when will the ITC be refunded? Is this say end of the tax year and then 6 months for review? That means 18 months. 18 months is a very long time for an SME. And then where do the other programs fit in, right? How can companies be bridged if they find themselves waiting for 18 months? What is included? What's capital cost? Is it, for example, in an electrolytic project, just the electrolyzer, or is it everything else that is part of the project? So it's many questions, right? Something that some members have asked, and this is something that the IRA has done really well, is can we see some examples? Can we have a very simple table that says, all right, my project expects to achieve this much in terms of carbon footprint, right? Kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of hydrogen produced. Therefore, I will stand here. With prevailing job conditions, etc., I will stand here, and this is what I can expect. And then you can bring this to investors. So that's a little bit on, I guess, on my opening statement. On Stephenville, you were asking about potential for exports. I was in Stephenville. That day there was a lot of excitement and a lot of interest. Now after I was coming back home, I started to reflect, and I thought, all right, 2025, that's bold. And what do we need to do? And then the engineer in me started thinking in terms of a Gantt chart, right? What needs to happen today so that we advance as fast as we can? We need to develop the renewable energy side of the projects, right? The wind side of the projects and the hydrogen side of the projects, right? You need to break ground, but long before you break ground, you need to get all the regulatory approvals in place. So thinking what can be done in parallel and how can we accelerate without cutting corners, right? So that we can get to that day when you break ground, and then you develop your whole project. So the idea of exporting hydrogen is a valid one, but it's also the idea of utilizing hydrogen domestically, right? We have 40 to 45% emission reduction targets for 2035 and net zero by 2050. So all those learnings.
Thank you, Ms. Vera Perez. I'm sorry, I just have limited time. I'm going to ask one more question to I believe it was Mr. Eaton from the Smart Prosperity Institute. Mr. Eaton, you gave us a list of sort of top opportunities, and I noted, unless I got it down incorrectly, that nuclear wasn't one of them. We've heard about nuclear and small modular reactors, particularly with respect to possibilities of getting Indigenous communities in the far north off of diesel fuel. Can you comment upon that and the potentials there for the transforming Canada's energy industry?
Yes, absolutely. No, you're correct in noting that I did not mention nuclear or small modular reactors in the list of sort of 8 top opportunity areas. That list is based on work we've done, but as I mentioned, also some others, including the Climate Institute, RBC. I would just say that the role of small modular reactors in the transition pathways is not, so there's not necessarily a large consensus. I think there is clearly evidence that there is particular opportunities for the types of situations that you are mentioning, remote communities in the far north. And there is potentially a competitiveness play. Our list, the list of 8 I was enumerating, is really about areas where we can have new economic value added cluster growth, ideally with some export opportunities. Yes, there are a lot of people who are very bullish on small modular reactors, but there are a few question marks around the, say, the timeline and the scale of that as, say, if you want to call it an industry. But that's, maybe it's in a second tier, if you want to call it that.
Thank you very much. On to Madame Sinclair Desaulniers for 6 minutes, please. And welcome to the committee today.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Dear colleagues, and thank you to all the witnesses for their very interesting opening statements. Globalization, as we knew it, no longer exists. Protectionism is back in fashion in a somewhat irrational way. And I mean, if the U.S. can so easily start trade war. Now, we see some interesting indicators and the amount of GDP invested in industrial policies. Some countries, those that are going to remain in the vanguard compared to other countries, are already investing in key sectors of their economies. And in that context, we have two solutions that are rather general that might apply. The first is to negotiate a change to the act that could include Canada in this U.S. environment. We could perhaps exclude some provisions, as was done for the Build Better Act. Secondly, and a number of witnesses have mentioned, to not fall behind and not be left behind. Quebec, Canada, wants to remain competitive and wants to implement public policies that will enable our key sectors to remain competitive. Now, in that context, my first question is for Madame Dufour. In the event that billions are injected in the U.S. economy, and billions also injected in China and also in Europe. So much money injected in the respective economies of these countries. How can Canada remain competitive? Thanks for your question. I am a lawyer. I'm sure there are many solutions, and other panelists have mentioned we need investment, we need strategic investment. As a lawyer, I think we have to also revisit some of our regulatory frameworks. Canada is lagging behind in terms of its due diligence and vigilance. Do we want our enterprises to continue to be competitive? Do we want to be able to export to Europe, Japan, North America, or every country in the world where countries have adopted very constraining legislation? Mexico is starting to do that. Legislation that's obliging their enterprises to be vigilant throughout their steps in the supply chains. So you have enterprises with, for instance, very high revenues. Their countries are obliging those enterprises to be very vigilant at every stage in the supply chain, and this in terms of environmental protection, human rights protection. And so this is modernization. There is enterprises are producing greener, more socially responsibly, and then able to legislate to countries where the threshold's very high. In Canada, we don't have such legislation, vigilance legislation. We're thinking of adopting legislation on forbidding the import of products that have been produced through slave labor or other but we need to modernize our Canadian legal framework so that our enterprises are obliged to be vigilant throughout the supply chain or in the production chain. But that's not going to modernize our acquisition, our public procurement, so that when enterprises purchase services, when there are big tenders on infrastructure projects, there needs to be obligations to procure responsibly. And if we were to modify those two frameworks, we would be able to restructure our market and make our businesses a lot more competitive and be able to tender more easily internationally and thereby make our businesses better. Thank you for that. You gave examples, sort of the carrot stick examples, or now on the stick side, do you have any examples to help with the carrot size? How could you help some sectors move forward? Well, that's what the other panelists mentioned. We need a clear strategic investment plan. It's the international trade rules do not forbid subsidies, providing those respect basic rules, and we absolutely need to be doing that. Thank you very much. A next question is for all of our witnesses, and I would hope that there are other questions along these lines. I would like to know from all witnesses, in the current version of the Inflation Reduction Act, in your opinion, what would need to be modified, and where should we push? What should the Canadian government position be in regard to that act? Ms. Dufour, maybe you can begin, and then we'll hear from the other witnesses.
Briefly, you have 17 seconds remaining.
Ce que je vous dirais, c'est
Well, what I would say is right now it's very difficult to change the legislation given the political situation in states. But Canada is privileged in this act right now. And when I talk about the illegality of the act, it would be vis-a-vis the WTO and other countries taking this to the WTO.
Thank you. Mr. Cannings, please, for 6 minutes.
Well, thank you. And I think I'll just follow up on that line of questioning. I was going to ask Ms. Dufour about, she brought up the statement that the IRA is illegal. I assume it wouldn't be in Canada's best interest to travel down that road and fight that. Certainly, in my riding, we've been fighting the softwood lumber battles for 30 years now, and those are issues where the Americans are taking us to tribunals and to court. We win every time, but it still is very devastating to our forest industry. So I'm assuming that it wouldn't be the best tactic for Canada to fight this, certainly through CUSMA or something like that. But you mentioned the WTO. Just perhaps briefly what you think, any avenues there for action by Canada, and would they be helpful considering that the IRA does favor Canada over other countries?
Je vous remercie.
Thank you, Mr. Canning. I think that question was addressed to me. It is my impression that Canada should not react. Certainly not before CUSMA or before WTO, because Canada managed to get a great deal in the last negotiation and the most recent version of the legislation. We are privileged compared to other countries of the world, and I fear, however, that other countries challenge the act before WTO, but with very uncertain outcomes, because the appeal process for WTO, is being slowed down by the U.S., the refusal to nominate new judges, and especially this with regard to CUSMA. So I think the danger would probably come from the Europeans or the Chinese, who could file a complaint before the dispute settlement process, but probably with, uncertain outcomes. And if I can just end by saying, those who worked drafting this act in the United States are very competent, very well aware that this act is illegal in terms of international trade rules. And our multilateral trade system is such that today, or certainly for a number of decades, that a country can decide to go in breach of the rules and pay for the consequence, pay taxes, pay compensation. And this is something that could be done if the U.S. were in good faith. I'm not saying they're good faith, but if the United States might just say, it is our priority, we know this act is illegal, and we will offer compensation.
Thank you, merci. I'd like to turn to Mr. Eaton. You mentioned, Mr. Eaton, towards the end of your presentation about the need for inclusive partnerships, that we have to act quickly, we have to act collaboratively, working groups. You know, I've heard in other committees about the importance of data and IP issues around acting quickly. I've heard in other committees about perhaps the need for crown corporations to bring groups together to do this. And I'm just wondering if you have any quick comments on what the structure of those collaborative partnerships might look like and what we need to do.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for the question. What those partnerships might look like? Well, I think there's some lessons to be taken from our recent history with the Industry Strategy Council, the economic strategy tables, which actually were a very good start, but they don't get to the next level down of getting more granular, getting more specific, developing plans and roadmaps. And so we've sketched out at Smart Prosperity, together with our collaborators in Transition Accelerator, we've sketched out a proposal which for building these collaborative partnerships with leadership from the federal government. And we would say that one way to do this is a lead department is tasked with delivering on a clean competitiveness goal, one of the areas I was mentioning, and the department is tasked with creating a sector strategy and roadmap. But these are then set up as effectively partnerships involving business stakeholders, also finance, First Nations, to develop a strategy that leads to the identification of priority projects, priority policy supports. And these sort of tables, if you want to call them that, a competitiveness table could be a competitiveness table for hydrogen, a competitiveness table for the electric vehicle and battery supply chain, would be asked to make periodic recommendations on three things: evaluating the effectiveness of current goals and strategies, identifying the mix of policies needed to achieve these goals, and identifying priority investments and projects for the sector. And ideally, you would have some form of working group to oversee the work of these various tables. That could be perhaps under the leadership of PMO or PCO, because it's important to find and identify the interdependencies, the connections across these areas.
Thank you very much, Thank you very much, Mr. Eaton. Sorry to cut you off. On to Mr. Martel for 5 minutes.
Oui, merci, Madame.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you for being here with us today. Madam Perez, I have a question. The IRA was voted on August 16th, 2022. Is it acceptable that the Government of Canada wait until the March 23 budget to respond to U.S. regulations?
Thank you for the question. Yes, August 16th. That was a very busy day for us in the sector. Right away, we started reaching out to government, to Natural Resources Canada, to the different departments. We filed a consultation as well. We put a pre-budget feedback letter. I wish the reaction had been quicker, but let's hope that this is because we were putting a lot of thought into how to react to IRA. For sure, I have been since August 16th in many multiple meetings, part of it educating, right? And discussing the implications for the sector as a whole, the short-term implications for Canada. Here we are today. My focus would be to say, all right, full economic statement has provided some good news. I believe there's still a lot of work to be done, but some good news in the form of ITC for clean technologies that can be partnered with hydrogen. And for hydrogen specifically, there's less work to make that functional, clear, provide examples to investors so that they don't continue to look south. And less to more. We haven't talked about the production side of things as well. So that would be my approach. Here we are today. Let's get this going.
Now, in light of the demands that your organization has been putting forward years, how to explain that Canada is still, and once again, lagging behind and not moving forward on these files?
Well, that's a very good question. Our position, my position, is always we're here to help. We're here to provide the knowledge, the wisdom, from the members, and the tools, right, that the members bring to the table. Let's just get the hydrogen is a tremendous opportunity for Canada for decarbonizing the economy. Let's get this going. The issue we have is one of scale. We need to scale up. The technology is ready. We don't need to talk about something that may be happening in 10 years. We have solutions for tomorrow morning. So we just need to get going.
Oui, Madame Perez.
Ms. Perez, recently you published an article in the Hill Times in which you state that Canada should be at the vanguard. And if in regard to hydrogen, Canada doesn't react quickly, will lag behind. Now, do you think the government should develop an ecosystem to support hydrogen production and also to encourage production? Could you elaborate on what you have stated in the Hill Times article? Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that question. So that was part of my reflections after Stephenville. Canada has a tremendous tradition on the electrolyzer manufacturing front and on the fuel cells front. This is where the electrolyzer was developed in Canada. And a lot of the cluster companies in the British Columbia area come from one initial company, Ballard, which is still around today and quite successful. So we have all that knowledge. We have that IP. We have the talent, the highly qualified individuals, and this is what we need to capitalize on. I have here the 1987 Canadian Hydrogen Strategy. This was my summer reading. We've been going at this for a long time. We were leaders when the world wasn't looking. Now everybody has jumped onto the bandwagon, and we really need to reclaim the leadership spot. It's almost an emotional topic for us in the sector, for me in particular. This is what I meant by we're lagging behind in terms of the leadership that we have always held. But we still have that IP, we still have that knowledge, we still have years of tradition and knowledge that's still in Canada.
Thank you very much. Ms. Dillon for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. I will start with Mr. Eaton. In March, the Smart Prosperity Institute published a document titled Canada's Future in a Net Zero World, which identified aluminum as a top priority for Canada in a net zero world. Can you please identify any specific industries that represent potential growth for the Canadian aluminum industry? And since this report was published, have you identified any new or strengthened market opportunities for Canadian aluminum producers? Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that question. Yes, we did identify producing green aluminum as an opportunity for transitioning Canada's aluminum industry and potentially having continued or new export opportunities by aluminum demanding sectors among our major trading partners. We have not done follow-up work on those market opportunities, to be clear. I did not mention green aluminum in the list of 8 top opportunities areas that I went through in my opening remarks. That is because we seem to be the only group that has identified that, and I was trying to offer a list where there was a consensus of opinion. I don't think there's any lack of consensus that among those of us who look in these areas that Canada needs to decarbonize major heavy industries, heavy emitting industries, of which aluminum is one, cement and concrete is another, steel is yet another. Aluminum is one that provides more export opportunities than those other 2 areas do, but they're also important in terms of maintaining domestic market share.
Thank you for that. And would you be able to elaborate a little bit more on the green aluminum? You said you were one of the only groups to identify it. Could you talk to us a little bit more about green aluminum, the benefits, and so forth? Thank you.
Well, the green aluminum is going to appear as the world transitions to net zero. Canada has an advantage with its industries at the moment in terms of one of the processing stages, and I'm actually not able to specify that for you right now. I could certainly follow up with providing you further information. There is perhaps a narrow window of opportunity, was what we heard in talking to a number of people in the industry and experts, that if Canada wants to seize some market share, particularly I think in Europe, then we would need to find ways for the industry to move faster. Of course, this is related to some of the other discussions we're having here around hydrogen and what is also mentioned, carbon capture utilization as these are critical components for decarbonizing the heavy industry.
Much. And you spoke a little bit about having more export opportunities and about decarbonization. Can you please tell us how decarbonization could be accelerated, or how you would envision that happening, and how it would affect exports as well? Thank you.
So the decarbonization of major industries such as aluminum, in our view, requires this strategic approach where a collaboration, a partnership, some form of collaborative strategic partnership is established involving the range of stakeholders, the industries, governments, relevant provincial governments, and finance and researchers to develop a roadmap effectively for how this should take place. And we stress that government needs to be at the table, but as we've seen with the cement roadmap initiative that's initiated, that ideally these types of partnerships develop a strategy for decarbonizing that particular industry that is not completely run by government, but where government is clearly present. These export opportunities would also be part of that scoping and road mapping process, that there would be potential for relevant stakeholders, whether it's researchers or those in the finance sector, as well as industry, to examine where those potential new markets will be strongest, particularly for, say, green certified decarbonized aluminum.
Thank you very much, Mr. Eaton. On to Madame Sinclair-Dessonnier for 2.5 minutes, please.
Merci, Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I would like to continue along the same line of questioning. Mr. Masterson, the testimony is very interesting when we heard about the assistance from certain provinces, Quebec, Alberta, for attracting foreign companies, all with a view to being more competitive. But when it comes to the Government of Canada, and in the context of this current act, what do you think the Canadian government should do to improve the legislation to benefit Canadian businesses?
Identify why are we here today? The IRA is the most audacious public policy instrument ever introduced to decarbonize a major economy in the world. And we're here talking about it because we all know it's going to work. What have they done? They have unleashed the power of private capital to attain a public good, which is decarbonization. We're busy, apologies to my colleague, but we're busy talking about strategies, plans, and tables. Strategies, plans, tables don't decarbonize anything. Investment decarbonizes. And so we have to come back to that. And I think we have to stop with the self-inflicted wounds. We have all these debates. Is it blue hydrogen? Is it green hydrogen? Guess what? In the IRA, they both count. It's a different level of incentive, but there's one for green and it's really high, and there's another one for blue and it still makes it cost competitive. We're debating in Canada, why haven't we seen the investment tax credit for carbon capture and storage? Because there are many critics that don't think it's a good idea. And yet we are one of the world's top 10 chemical producers. It is one of our easiest solutions to obtain decarbonization in our sector. We have to move on these things. The time to study, as we heard from Egypt over the past 2 weeks, the time for studies and tables and plans and frameworks is gone. It's the time to invest quickly, and that's what Canada has to do, and we're talking about it because the Americans are doing it incredibly quickly.
Merci.
Thank you. Just a quick follow-up. In the current act, could we try to change anything to better accommodate or protect Canadian businesses from the IRA? Could I have a few seconds? I will repeat. In the context of the IRA, is there anything the Canadian government could ask for to reduce the impacts on Canadian businesses?
Okay, I'm sorry, we have to suspend for a minute here. We've got a problem with our translation then. Okay, maybe need to turn, just 1 minute. The clerk will maybe have to raise the volume on it or something.
Testing the English translation. Excellent. Thank you very much, Madam Chair, for your indulgence. Let me repeat the question a third time. In the context of the current version of the IRA, is there anything the Canadian government could ask for to accommodate or reduce impacts on Canadian businesses?
From the chemistry sector, I haven't seen anything that disadvantages us. Again, I would say the challenges we face are largely self-inflicted. I do worry when we look at some of the other sectors, such as critical minerals and looking at supply chain. But again, as Madame Dufour said, there's a nod to CUSMA that perhaps we're covered, so I wouldn't be an expert to say. Nothing that stands out from a chemistry perspective.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Cannings, please, for 2.5 minutes.
Okay, well, I will... I'd just like to ask a quick question to both Ms. Dufour and Mr. Masterson. Mr. Masterson brought up the concern, I don't know if this is one of your self-inflicted wounds, but the carbon pricing that causes some issues I've heard it a lot in terms of exports from Canada. And I just wanted to know from Ms. Dufour what the prospects of getting border adjustments in place that would level that playing field, and then if there's time, if Mr. Masterson can comment as well. Ms. Dufour? Oh.
Thank you for your question. The issue of the border is most relevant. when you think of international trade. The European Union is going to implement, probably in the next months, it might get delayed, but a carbon adjustment at the border. So our businesses that are going to export to Europe, for example, aluminum, steel, and others will have to pay surtaxes when their products enter into the European markets. So yes, we need to think about our price on carbon. We're sort of squeezed between Europe and the United States, our other big trading company that has no price on carbon, whereas Europe has a high price. And US doesn't appear to want to adjust at the border. So we had a consultation 1 year ago in regard to this, and we have to really also be vigilant about what's happening at WTO, because likely the next trade war, these carbon adjustments at the border. Thank you.
Mr. Masterson, do you have any comments about carbon border adjustments to level that playing field?
I think they'll be incredibly complex, and by the time we figure them out, it will be too damaging. And just to be clear, our sector is not against carbon pricing. The proposals I talked about have all been introduced despite the Canadian carbon pricing going to $170 a ton within the next decade. It can be a major incentive, but we have to ask the question, what are we doing with the revenues? If those are simply moved out of the productive sectors and set aside for other reasons, and we're not putting things back in the way the American IRA does, then we have a significant problem. So yes, it can spurn the type of activity we want, but we have to still think about what's the cost of capital at the end of the day, and is Canada maintaining a competitive landscape to attract these investments?
Thank you very much. On to Ms. Lewis. And welcome to the committee today.
Thank
nice
you.
to have you here.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I thank the witnesses for their testimony today. My first question is for Dr. Dorfour through the Chair. Thank you, Dr. Dorfour, for your explanation of the illegality of the IRA, and you highlighted 3 points that I find very interesting: the violation of the national treatment principle, the violation of the most favored nation status under the GATT, and also the violation of the subsidies and countervailing measures agreement. Now, I'm sure that you're familiar with the Canada feed-in tariff case that was before the dispute settlement body, where they actually invoked an exception under, I believe it was Section 8, for the subsidies and countervailing measures agreement. And that exception was that if there's a new industry, that would not be deemed to be a violation of the most favored nation status under the GATT. Do you believe that the U.S. would invoke this exception and perhaps even have climate change viewed as a global public good? And also, because these industries will be new industries, do you think that this would be a viable exception?
Je vous remercie pour votre question.
Thank you for your question. It's very technical. I don't believe I've thought through so far everything that you've referred to. I have read a great deal about what experts have to say since August, and I haven't seen anybody comment on what you raise. So to answer your question without preparation is difficult, but it is not my impression, not at this stage, that we can make that appreciation at this time. And it's pretty difficult for the United States to justify their act. But I did not give you a legal opinion earlier in my statement. I gave a rather broad overview because the IRA contains a number of measures, which is not to say that each measure equals a breach. We'd have to really go into the details. But of the experts I've read or spoken to, they're categorical. It is legislation that contravenes basic rules, and there's really no justification that they can invoke. They could invoke national security, but probably national security would not justify all of the measures contained in the Act. Thank you.
My next question is for Mr. Matherson. And you highlighted that the criteria to get on the good list isn't transparent. And that's highly problematic because if we're very serious about protecting the environment, we want transparency. And even though the IRA framework is not the perfect framework, at least there is a framework. And so my question to you is do you believe that Canada needs a similar framework? And because without it, there's a lack of transparency, and that, I'm assuming, would have some impact, some barrier on economic development.
Absolutely. Let me just share with you by way of example, Alberta. Major chemical producing sector had no investments, new investments for more than 2 decades. Under the NDP government, they introduced a tax credit. $500 million worth of tax credits. It was a competitive process. They selected 2, over $7 million of proposed investments. But here's the thing. They had 26 applicants, more than $40 billion of investment they had to turn away because they had to pick winners and losers. What the government eventually did in Alberta is they moved to the U.S. state-style approach, which is, here's the criteria. If you meet these criteria, you qualify for these incentives. Our sector now qualifies in Alberta, if you have the right investment, for 15%, 12 to 15% of the capital cost of the project. And suddenly now I'm here before you telling you we have 15 projects worth $30 to $40 billion of proposed activity. So that's the illustration of what's the difference between saying, yeah, we got some money, make an application. It depends on the government of the day. It depends on if you're on a naughty list. We don't know the criteria. You might win, you might lose. To saying, as the U.S. does, it's available to everybody. Bring your capital. We want your capital. It's pretty clear.
5 you know how you get on the naughty list?
No, it's just I'm just trying to use something different than a carrot and a stick. You've heard carrots and sticks a lot. I thought I'd try to spice it up for you.
It's much spicier. It's much more interesting. Thank you. Minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for all the witness on your testimony in the Standing Committee. First, I'd like to ask Mr. Eaton through the Chair. In your website, it makes a mention of how clean innovation and growth is essential to Canadian economy across all industry. Which sectors have the greatest opportunity to implement clean innovation, and how can Canadian companies use programs such as the Canada Growth Fund to accelerate clean innovation?
Thank you. I think the sectors that we've identified as offering the greatest opportunities for clean growth in a net zero transition are the ones that I've mentioned at the beginning: electric vehicles and the battery supply chain, carbon capture, utilization, and storage as a sector or technology, biofuels, especially sustainable aviation fuels, hydrogen, alternative and plant-based proteins, mass timber and related forest wood products, critical minerals, again related to the battery supply chain, and ag tech. These are all areas where decarbonization involves a tremendous amount of innovation. In some cases, it's much more advanced, as we know in the case of hydrogen, and as we've heard today. In some of these other areas, there's a much longer research or innovation pathway that's required. And I do agree with what has been said by some of my fellow witnesses. We do need investments, and we see that the Inflation Reduction Act makes clearer incentives than we have in Canada. But in some of these sectors, the investments, especially to pursue these innovation pathways, require a certain amount of coordination. And if we think about the overall investment envelope that we're talking about, the figure that was mentioned earlier in this session, for example, that was estimated by RBC of $2 trillion in total, or 80 billion per year. There's actually investment. The capital is scarce, and we need to take a strategic approach to ensure that for these, particularly for these growth opportunities, the growth, and the reason we're worried about the growth opportunities is because at the moment, 20% of our exports of goods and services comes from the oil and gas sector. Over the next 20 to 30 years, we can likely expect that that value of those exports is going to decrease. Where is the value going to increase across our other sectors? And that's why we look at these emerging innovative green or clean competitiveness opportunities.
Thank you. And you also co-authored an article in the National Observer on how the IRA paved a path for Canadian action on clean growth. What aspect of the recent Fall Economic Statement positioned Canada to realize the potential for clean growth, and what step do you think the government should take to further its action on it?
The Fall Economic Statement advances a little more clarity on a couple of points. In particular, the Canada Growth Fund, which is a key instrument of effectively of our net zero industrial policy, although there's still question marks there. So that's perhaps the brightest light within the Fall Economic Statement. I would say that some of the announcements around our tax credits are perhaps encouraging, but we're failing to provide the certainty, both the certainty in terms of the actual specifics of those instruments, as well as the certainty in terms of the actual mechanics. For example, with hydrogen, are we providing tax credits based on an overall investment, or are we providing, as in the U.S., tax credits based on a kilogram of hydrogen produced? So there are some encouraging signs, but I think what I would like to emphasize is, even with the Canada Growth Fund, we are concerned that we're creating an array of funding instruments from the Strategic Innovation Fund, the Net Zero Accelerator Fund, the Canada Growth Fund, and each of these is being set up effectively in isolation of each other. And there are certain barriers to particularly pursuing these medium-term investment pathways that are not going to be overcome. It's going to be too difficult for the market participants to work out where those pathways are, and accessing and combining these various financing mechanisms, which in general are well conceived, but it's the strategic aspect of it that's important. It's identifying where the strategic opportunities are, ensuring those funds are aligned with strategic opportunities, and that means more than taking a passive approach to just accepting applications.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you to all of our witnesses. We do not have sufficient time to start another round, so I just want to thank you all for very valuable information and sharing your time with us today. So I will suspend for 2 minutes, that we have to go into committee business following the suspension.
Thank you.